Welcome to American Education FM, everybody. I'm Dr. Sean Brooks. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Here's where I'd like to begin. I have a number of things to bring up, specifically, of course, in the field of education and their continued financial collapse, which I think is going to be really, really interesting as this continues to work its way, certainly at the state level. And then state legislators have a decision to make. And as many of them already know, certainly in more conservative states, they fully understand that public education is not good business. I'll get to that a little bit later, but let me mention this first. And this has to do with, I think, the larger disclosure that's taking place for the American public and certainly the world public. I have no doubt that endless things, of course, have occurred in our country that have been scripted. As I mentioned in a past episode and spent a pretty good deal of time on it talking about the similarities between the art of the deal and the art of war, I think one of the things that's taking place here is that you have to lead certain individuals in a certain direction, in order to believe that a particular thing is taking place, in particular when that thing is sort of the normal narrative that everybody's been familiar with in the past. For example, and again, it's a bad look if it's to be believed at face value. It's a terrible look. But the whole business of, again, Donald Trump approving weapons to continue to go over to Israel. Again, I've seen video footage of bombs being loaded off of trucks to allegedly, again, be used against Palestinians in Gaza and God knows where else. Syria, who's to really say? Either way, it's disturbing at face value. But if there's more to it than what meets the eye, then that's also possible. Because again, that's part of the art of the deal and the art of war, is that, again, you're leading individuals in a particular direction to believe that the same old is what is transpiring, when in fact, behind the scenes, something else is taking place. So, let me mention this. I came across a video, which I believe I put up on both Gab and X. And it's a 21-minute video, and it's a woman who calls in to one of these shows that, an individual has on Rumble or wherever they have their show. And she starts to describe how basically everything that we saw, both within Q posts and then the things that even the average public, so to speak, saw, with certainly the Biden administration, would imply that they were probably not in charge of everything that was going on, certainly not specific hires. Not to mention, if you peel that back just a little bit more, who's to say again that the military wasn't in charge of everything that was transpiring? It's not to say that people weren't dying, that innocent people weren't being killed throughout this entire time, because they certainly were, certainly within the last 4 to 5 years of the fake Biden administration. But some of the moves that were made by his administrations were so obviously awkward and remarkably unprofessional that you would have to say that this was being done in order to either mortify or terrorize or embarrass or whatever the United States and certainly the citizens within. If not, again, an attempt to demoralize them to some extent, but certainly embarrass the ever-living hell out of them. Let me give you a couple of examples. You saw, and you may recall, the military photographs, for example, the stock photographs that military individuals will take to identify themselves, and some of those people were wearing bondage masks, sexually related dog masks, as their actual military photo. Now, again, a person would have to say, is that standard procedure? Is that really allowed? Is that one of the things that typically takes place? Or was that allowed, or were they told to do that? Or was someone told to do that, and then they put it out there as if the Biden administration was really allowing it, really doing it, when in fact they may not have been? I really don't know. Again, it's warfare, and it's psychological warfare, and it's confusing as hell. You also had the other guy, who again was allegedly in charge of all of the weapons in the United States and the nuclear weapons, and this was a cross-dressing tranny. This was the bald guy with the shaved head, who again was wearing high heels and lipstick and the whole thing. And then he had a penchant for, of course, stealing luggage at airports and was being arrested for such. Again, was that real? Or was that scripted to show people that this is the lengths to which this particular political party will go to in order to do whatever it is that they're doing? And at the exact same time, specifically regarding that person, and I forget their name, but either way, that particular individual was never brought in front of Congress to answer questions under any circumstance whatsoever, regardless of their involvement, qualifications, or arrests for stealing luggage, if that even happened. Again, it's just too odd. The things that happened during his fake administration, and we know he didn't win the presidency, but those things were just too odd. That given all of the Q posts saying you're watching a movie, it had to be this way. It makes sense. It makes sense to a great extent, because you have to see these individuals, again, being so absurd that some of these individuals have to be plants. They had to be plants. It was, again, it was too embarrassing. It was just too embarrassing for them to even exist, let alone on a national stage under the guise of actually working for a presidential administration. So again, it's already even come out that all of the pardons that Joe Biden allegedly signed, of course, are all illegal. Well, we knew that already, because he wasn't a lawful president. And then a judge recently ruled that you can't do blanket pardons because you just can't do that. There's really no other explanation. So I would basically say this. As confusing as all of this is, I don't think the confusion has necessarily gone away now that Donald Trump is formally back in the White House. You're seeing a completely different way in which his administration operates. It's far more professional. It's far more direct. It's not this playground feelings, pathological lying, we're all gay, deal with it mentality. It really is, again, very strict, very professional, seems to be that way. And it's not even to say that some of the individuals who were confirmed to be the heads of particular departments like Pete Hegseth or Kristi Noem, I know that they were confirmed. I know that a piece of paper was signed to put them, quote unquote, in charge. But if there's a military apparatus that knows far more about what's really going on than Pete Hegseth or Kristi Noem, well, then that would mean that Pete Hegseth and Kristi Noem and people like them are not really in charge. They're the head of the organization on paper, but there's people behind the scenes who really know what's happening. And those are the individuals, again, really running the entire show. In fact, if you think about it from this standpoint, it's kind of like that in almost every single working environment, is it not? I mean, you have the boss, so to speak, or, certainly in a school setting, you have a principal of a school building. But everybody knows that the principal of a school building doesn't really know what goes on a day in and day out basis inside of a building. There's no way that they can. They're the manager of adults, but it's the adults who are working behind the scenes who really know what's happening on a day in and day out basis, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But if there's an entity, so to speak, that exists even behind that is working, hopefully, for the forces of good rather than evil, to then filter information through those channels to get it back to the people in charge, knowing full well that those people that we do not see are the people really controlling things, then, again, that's pretty much the breakdown of our entire government. The people that we see at face value are part of the show. And my hope is that there are good things happening, even though that there's certainly plenty of bad things happening to either solidify or pacify the people who have just sort of always gone along to get along. Again, like your standard politicians, like I mentioned in the last episode, how on earth can you have Democrats and Republicans meeting again in Germany or wherever they were meeting in Europe with Zelensky sitting down in a room, him shaking all of their hands, all of them looking back at him and going, yeah, we're on your side, don't you worry, we're going to get you what you need. And then, of course, Lindsey Graham running his mouth and saying everything that he says without something else really taking place. Again, this back and forth of, well, Zelensky's not allowed to meet with Donald Trump, Putin, and MBS in Saudi Arabia, but now all of a sudden he's allowed to, allegedly. Again, it's constant misdirection. It's this thing is allowed and this thing is taking place, and then whoops, nope, this thing is taking place and now this is allowed, as far as anybody is concerned. So my point is that it's still warfare and it's still constant misdirection. And there's no doubt about that. Again, even the soft disclosure of all of the finances that are being revealed, this is being done not for us because we should already know this. Dating back again to the Obama administration and certainly Bush and even before them. For example, again, you had whatever it was, $4 trillion just went missing and was unaccounted for and not even tracked based on either the Federal Reserve or the Treasury or USAID or whichever organization was in charge of those trillions of dollars. There was never any kind of an identifying label associated with it. Of course, that's making the news and that's pissing off everybody, and rightfully so, but that's not even new. Again, it was the day before 9/11 when Donald Rumsfeld came out and said, whoops, we misplaced 20-some-odd trillion dollars and we don't know where it went. And then wouldn't you know it, an inside explosion inside of the Pentagon from inside of the Pentagon happens the very next day. So it's not like missing money and laundered money and stealing from the American public and taxpayer has been a new thing. This has gone on since the beginning of taxes. This has been going on, of course, since the beginning of three-letter agencies and NGOs and outside influence and inside influence in the whole thing. Now, of course, there's a lot of talk about Fort Knox. Let's go into Fort Knox and see whether or not Fort Knox has any gold. And where's all the gold and where's all the gold? It's been stolen, if we even have it. There's been plenty of rumors we have plenty of gold, that we've even stolen it back from the Vatican, even England for that matter. There's basically just too much to keep track of here, and it's just a lot of headlines. There's not a lot of real analysis taking place as to what is actually going on a constant basis. We know it's all criminal. We know it's the Jewish lobby. We know it's satanic money launderers and everybody else who's involved in this, and of course it's politicians on the right and the left. But these headlines are directing individuals, certainly your average American citizen, into different directions in order to, again, soft disclose what's been going on this entire time that they've been alive and what's really been happening, rather, with their tax dollars. And that should anger them. But again, there was this theory, and I know I'm bouncing around here, and that's because, again, a lot of this is confusing. But there's this theory, again, which has been making the rounds yet again, and it has to do with Zelensky. That Zelensky, of course, being an ex-actor himself, is in fact playing a role for the good guys in order to entrap the bad guys. That basically he's a honeypot. And any time these politicians are actually showing up to meet him, these politicians aren't thinking to themselves that they're engaging in any illegality while meeting with him, even though he's on the record as saying that he doesn't like Donald Trump, his soldiers are on video burning effigies of Donald Trump, and all of this other stuff. Not to mention, again, you have the UK Prime Minister saying that he wants to send troops to Ukraine. All of this seems remarkably shady, but it almost implies that these individuals are not in charge. They're either controlled by good guys or they're controlled by bad guys, and they are putting the pedal to the metal here on basically trying to ramp up something to create some conflict, not knowing that good guys are actually in control of a great deal of what's going on. Again, I know it's confusing because it confuses the hell out of me too. But I think the point here is that it's warfare, and it's designed to be confusing because it has to be. If you think of your average American citizen, they have no idea what the hell is going on, and they're only thinking one-dimensionally about any particular thing that pops up. Even if they actually see a headline that is factually accurate, which of course you're not going to see on the mainstream media by and large unless you're watching Fox News, and even that's not the full dimensional perception of what's actually taking place. But even so, that should be enough to lead people into a direction of, wow, this is really upsetting. I can't believe our government's doing this and has been doing this whole time. My point is that all of this is way too scripted. And it's obviously scripted, which means, again, this soft disclosure that's happening for the American public and the world public is a step-by-step process in order to, again, strip power away from government and give it back to the people. Of this, I have basically no doubt. There is no doubt that that is the case. You take less power away from government, you take all of this stolen money away from them, then they're just left with their salaries, possible insider trading, and then that's the end of it. Of course, that has to be outlawed, hopefully someday also. But let me read you this, because again, this is sort of a back and forth, multi-dimensional look at things. This is from Joe Lang. I've read a couple of his posts in the past on X, and he says the following here again regarding Zelensky, Saudi Arabia, Putin, Xi, Trump, the whole thing. He says the following here, quote, "Can I offer a possibility? There is something happening and it's becoming a bigger story each day in the public narrative, quote unquote. I can't help but think that it's a distraction. It seems like a similar playbook from the past. What is this big story? Marco Rubio has arrived in Saudi Arabia to meet with a Russian delegation to discuss a peace deal in the Russian-Ukraine war. Is that what's really going on? Why are they meeting in Saudi Arabia? Why wasn't a delegation from Ukraine invited to these negotiations? What if the meetings are just a distraction for the media? What if the peace deal has already been negotiated and is a done deal? What if it's been a done deal for a while now? If that's true, why have this meeting? What's the common denominator between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia? They are the three biggest oil producers in the world. Just a coincidence? Is this meeting in Saudi Arabia for a bigger reason? Are they coordinating something much bigger than a peace deal? Does it have to do with oil? Maybe the end to the petrodollar? Why would I think that? They said, is it just a coincidence that Trump recently talked on the phone to both Putin and Xi? Coincidence that Trump just met with Modi at the White House? What do these world leaders have in common? Putin, Xi, and Modi are the most powerful leaders of BRICS. Saudi Arabia was supposed to join BRICS on January 1st, 2024, but MBS has yet to confirm their membership. What if he does announce that they are joining BRICS? What do you think that would do to the petrodollar? What would it do to the Fed and the world's central bank debt system? Wouldn't that send shockwaves throughout the central bank's debt system? Have you noticed that Trump came out several times on Truth Social lately completely bashing and threatening BRICS? I do remember that. As a quick side note, I also remember him saying that BRICS is dead. He said it in the Oval Office. Well, BRICS is dead and all I have to do is just tariff them and then BRICS will die. Well, maybe the whole BRICS thing, again, was a coordinated plan during the Biden administration. That those foreign countries were putting that together, again, as a coordinated plan to be a threat to the Federal Reserve. That's just a side note. Anyway, they moved on here and they said he threatened them with 100% tariffs if they used their own currency for trade instead of the dollar. BRICS was developing a stable coin for trade that is backed by a basket of commodities and protects each country's sovereignty by allowing them to use their own currencies. Do you think Trump is really against a system like that, which creates an even playing field for all countries? When Trump met at the White House with Modi, they talked a lot about trade deals, but I don't remember any mention of BRICS. And Modi certainly didn't say that India was leaving BRICS or ending their development of a BRICS stablecoin. I also didn't hear anything about BRICS related to Trump's conversations with Putin and Xi. This after Trump threatened 100% tariffs on the BRICS nations if they tried to come up with their own currency for trade instead of staying trapped in the centralized system controlled by the Fed and the Federal Reserve note. Does Trump really want the world to stay trapped in this centralized debt system? Trump's threats against BRICS seemed way too over the top to me. Was Trump going over the top to protect the fiat dollar? Why? Remember, Trump is always speaking to two different audiences. Those who know we are in war with a hidden enemy and those that think this is still about politics, all about politics. Which audience of Americans do you think Trump was talking to when he said 100% tariffs on BRICS and BRICS is dead? With such over-the-top threats, why wasn't BRICS part of the narrative with these BRICS leaders? Trump knows what's coming. He knows that he's going to bankrupt the Fed and bring down the entire worldwide debt system. He's not going to protect the Federal Reserve Note. The Federal Reserve Note will go into the trash bin of history with all the other fiat currencies. What Trump is doing is setting an example for all world leaders. Every world leader should want to protect their country's currency. I think we are getting closer to the takedown of the central bank system and the petrodollar. I think there are plans being discussed and timed with these nations, and they are using peace deals as a cover story, unquote. Again, you have to take into account all of the recent talk now about gold and Fort Knox. And I don't think that's an accident. The timing of it is, again, the soft disclosure of something else actually happening behind the scenes. There's a person here who responded to Joe Lang, Jeff Pasquino, I'm saying that right. Anyway, here's what they said, and Joe Lang seemed to agree with them. They said the following. They said, glad to see you brought up BRICS. Modi is the key to it all. India is the keystone to BRICS. India has a big labor force and works with most everyone. The Saudis, Russia, and India know that Trump leads the way toward both peace and fair trade. And several bad actors and their horrible actions will fall by the wayside if they are excluded by the U.S. and BRICS. What trading partners would the EU have if they were excluded from both working with the U.S. and also BRICS nations? That's a terrible spot for the likes of France and Germany. They wrapped up and said BRICS and Putin were doing all of the legwork to set everything up for the past 4 years of Trump's return, a coordinated and to central banks across the globe could be the final nail in the proverbial coffin for this economic enslaving system. And then they responded, Joe Lang did, and said, I think you're right. Again, I put this in the same category as the business of Palestinians being slaughtered. It's the same kind of thing. That's blatantly obvious. Endless individuals have seen that. It doesn't matter the news outlet, whether they ignore it or not. The truth exists everywhere. It's out there. There's no avoiding it, really. If you don't get it in the mainstream, you're getting it on social media. And if you're ignoring it on social media in the mainstream, well, then you're just dead asleep and, you're probably vaccinated and, God be with you. But at the exact same time, there has to be more taking place than what meets the eye. So again, I know that Marco Rubio was over there shaking hands with Netanyahu and, we're going to do whatever we can and finish the job against Iran. The funny part about that, of course, is that no one can name an Iranian bad guy. No one can say to themselves, so what's the thing that Iran's done recently that's caused any kind of a so-called terror attack? What is it that they've done? Who have they killed? And the answer is nobody knows. So the only, again, one-dimensional, old-school wavelength of thought is that people are screaming, well, Iran's the bad guy, so they must be. All these politicians are over there overseas in Europe, and they're saying that Iran's the bad guy, so that must be true. What have they actually done? What's Iran done to anybody? Are they hurting us? No. They hurting anybody over there? Hell, I don't know. No one's even talking about it. No one's bringing any of it up. Which means I think the vast majority of the human populace, certainly here in America, has graduated from listening to politicians and just believing what they say to now going, well, they say Iran's the enemy, which means they're probably not. Which means the real answer lies way deeper than even that. So again, I'm not going to pretend to know all the ins and outs of what's actually taking place, but I do believe that the bad guys are being basically forced into the sunshine here for endless people to see because we know who they are. but they're being forced into the light so that people who never paid attention to it in the past finally see these individuals for who they actually are, what they've actually done, and what they continue to perpetuate. Again, there's only two people, by and large, outside of course, other very heinous crimes, and certainly, again, everything that the German government is doing to their own people at this stage of the game with their free speech laws and lack of free speech laws, I should say, and imprisoning people for just putting memes out on the internet. But at the exact same time, there's really only two bad guys that exist that the world can take a look at with a hard eye, and that's Netanyahu and Zelensky. That's really it. There really doesn't seem to be anybody else, which isn't bad. I'm not saying that other world leaders haven't done bad stuff. They certainly have. Macron's terrible, and Trudeau's terrible, and of course his whole government is terrible, and Scheinbaum in Mexico's terrible. I mean, the list is endless. I mean, there are bad people everywhere, but there's only one physical kinetic war taking place. And that, of course, has to do with two individuals who happen to be Jewish who are slaughtering their own people and slaughtering innocent people. And I think most populations see that that's exactly who it is that's engaging in this war here. So an end has to come to them. I think that's only a matter of time. But I also think, again, just to sort of summarize everything here that I've mentioned for the first 26 some odd minutes, is that deterrence in itself is a good strategy, certainly in a war like this. You have to make examples of certain people. You have to bring them into the limelight and expose them for who they truly are, to then get lower players to essentially say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I'm backing away from this. It's possible I've broken a bunch of laws, probably have. I was certainly playing for the wrong team. So now, so to speak, I'm just going to back away. And I think you're seeing that, and I think we all are seeing that, certainly when it comes to resignations of judges, resignations of individuals within these three-letter agencies. They don't want anything to do with it anymore. They're all backing away. And again, a lot of these so-called resignations are being perpetuated among the public and in the news media as being, well, they're being fired by the Trump administration. I'm not doubting that people are getting fired. I just guarantee that way more are resigning because they don't want to get caught up in this. They know that something else is going on here because, again, this is too coordinated. It's just too coordinated. And I don't think it's just domestically. I think it's globally. I think this is happening worldwide here. So, again, it's confusing. I fully understand, and I'm just one guy. I'm not claiming to have any of the full-blown answers to any of this. It's just food for thought. But no one's going to convince me that a cross-dresser dressing up as a woman who had a penchant for stealing luggage at airports was in charge of nuclear weapons in our country. I'm sorry, but I don't buy that. That was a show. That was all a script, and that individual never came in front of any congressional hearing one time, not once. Why is that? Sam Britton was his name. My apologies. I just looked it up. Sam Britton. His title was American Nuclear Waste Disposal Expert. Again, it's laughable. I can't believe that people believed that when it was actually happening. It's too comical. Again, I'll leave it at that. It's possible that was a logical hire and that somebody was like, you need to hire this person. They deserve a promotion and they're beyond qualified. But again, the optics of it. Just the visual optics of a tranny being in charge of something like that, or a cross-dresser being in charge of something like that with that title, I'm sorry. It just looks unprofessional. And I'm not saying professionalism was their thing back in the day when Biden was around. I mean, it certainly wasn't. But I just think more is going on here. Okay, education stuff. Now, you talk about more going on. You would think that the American education system would want to pay attention to this. You would think that they would want to teach this. in the American education system and in teacher education programs, you name it. But of course, they won't. And there's a very good reason why they don't, because they're afraid that if they even knew about this, which, let's face it, those doing the instructing on teacher training have no idea that this even exists. They just trust everything that their TV tells them. They have no idea that their government purposefully weaponized education to be a brainwashing apparatus with the help of foreign countries, and that all of that was on purpose. Again, if people in the business understood this, they would leave the business, or they would rework their contracts to allow them to teach the truth about the business, the history of the business, and why the business is failing the way that it is now. So there was this particular post, and I want to play a little bit of audio at the end of this, if I can separate it out properly, because it was a long interview. But there was an interview here that was done in 1981 where G. Edward Griffin was interviewing a guy by the name of Norman Dodd. And Norman Dodd died in 1987, of course, 6 years after this particular interview. And here's what this particular post says from a Kimberly Kim Wexler MAJD on X. They said the following here. It's kind of lengthy, so bear with me. They said, quote, Norman Dodd, 1899 to 1987, was an investment banker and independent researcher. In 1953, he was asked to serve as Director of Research for the U.S. House Select Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations, aka the Reece Committee. It was formed during the McCarthy era to investigate un-American activities, quote-unquote, which Dodd defined as a, quote, a determination to effect changes in the country by unconstitutional means, unquote. Tax-exempt foundations and comparable institutions, including what we call today non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and 501c3 nonprofit corporations were investigated to ensure that their aims and activities were consistent with their tax-exempt status. Again, apparently this interview occurred between the two of them in 1982, so my apologies, but it says in a 1982 interview with G. Edward Griffin, Dodd shared facts he uncovered during the investigation that did not appear in the Congressional Committee's final report. Dodd told Griffin that in a conversation with Rowan Gaither, then president of the Ford Foundation and co-founder of the Rand Corporation, Dodd was told the following, quote, Mr. Dodd, all of us who have had a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We have had experience operating under directives. These directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Mr. Dodd, we are here to operate in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union, unquote. Basically, summary, bring the United States closer to communism. It moves on here. It says, Dodd went on to relate the story of Catherine Casey, an attorney at Dodd's research team. Casey was assigned to investigate the Carnegie Endowment by reading the handwritten minute books for the endowment, which was founded in 1908. Casey spent several weeks spot reading sections of the minutes covering time periods that Dodd had flagged, and she recorded her findings via dictaphone. Dodd relates that during their first meeting in 1908, the Carnegie Endowment trustees, quote, raise a specific question which they discuss throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known that is more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that there is no more effective means than war to that end, is known to humanity. So then, in 1909, they raise the second question and discuss it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? And finally, quote, They answer that question as follows: we must control the State Department. Casey found that after World War I, the minutes of the Carnegie Endowment trustees reflect a shift in their interest to prevent what Dodd calls, quote, a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914 when World War I broke out, unquote. Dodd explains that the trustees decided they, quote, must control education in the United States, unquote. Realizing the task was too big for them alone, the Carnegie Endowment enlisted the assistance of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Guggenheim Foundation. Together they focused on the teaching of American history and worked to cultivate their own stable, quote-unquote, of American history professors who would support their agenda. And then it ends with this quote: the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency, unquote. Now here's what I want to do. I want to play some of this interview here so you can hear some of this directly from Norman Dodd, again regarding his role in the Reece Committee from 1981. And again, he's specifically being interviewed by G. Edward Griffin. But he talks about his role. He talks about, again, how he was marginalized, specifically, of course, once he started to figure out what he figured out regarding the influx of communism in American education and how the entire government was behind all of this. And then what do you think they labeled him as once he, of course, figured this out and brought this to their attention? I mean, he's bringing the problem that the enemy is creating back to the enemy, which means what do you think they labeled him as? If you guessed anti-Semite, you would be correct. See, this is just old nonsense. So I'm going to play a few minutes of this again just so you can hear them. So give this a listen here in 3, 2, 1.
And so I brought up the subject of the spread of the influence of the Soviet world, and for 2 hours discussed this with Hayes, and finally ended up with his rising from his desk and saying, Norm, if you will carry this investigation toward the goal as you've outlined it to me, I'll be your biggest supporter. I said, Mr. Hayes, I can assure you that I will not double-cross you. Subsequently, Mr. Hayes sent word to me that he was in the Bethesda hospital with an attack of ulcers, but would I come and see him, which I did. He then said, Norm, the only reason I've asked you to come out here is I just want to hear you say again, you will not double-cross me. I gave him that assurance, and that was the basis of our relationship. Meantime, counsel took the attitude expressed in these words, Norm, if you want to waste your time with this guy, as he called him, you can go ahead and do it, but don't ever ask me to say anything to him under any condition on any subject. So, in a sense, that cleared the decks for me to operate in relation to Hayes on my own. And as time passed, Hayes offered friendship, which I hesitated to accept because of his vulgarity. And I didn't want to get mixed up with him socially under any condition. Well, that was our relationship for about 3 months, and then eventually I had occasion to add to my staff, and as a result of adding to my staff a top-flight intelligence officer, both the Republican National Committee and the White House were resorted to stop me from continuing this investigation in the direction that Carol Reece had personally asked me to do, which was to utilize this investigation, Mr. Griffin, to uncover the fact that this country had been the victim of a conspiracy. That was Mr. Reese's conviction. I eventually agreed to carry it out. I explained to Mr. Reece that his own counsel wouldn't go in that direction. He gave me permission to disregard our own counsel. And I had then to set up an aspect of the investigation outside of our office, more or less secret. And the Republican National Committee got wind of what I was doing, and they did everything they could to stop me. They appealed to counsel to stop me, and finally they resorted to the White House.
Was their objection because of what you were doing or because of the fact that you were doing it outside of the official auspices of the committee?
No, their objection was, as they put it, my devotion to what they call anti-Semitism. That was a cooked-up idea, but in other words, it wasn't true at all. But anyway, that's the way I expressed it. And
excuse me, why?
And they made it stick.
Why did they do that? How could they say that?
Well, they could say it, Mr. Griffin, but they had to have something in the way of a rationalization of their decision to do everything they could to stop the completion of this investigation in the direction that it was moving, which would have been an exposure of this Carnegie Endowment story and the Ford Foundation and the Guggenheim and the Rockefeller Foundation, all working in harmony toward the control of education in the United States. Well, in any event, to secure the help of the White House in the picture, they assigned, they got the White House to cause the liaison personality between the White House and the Hill, a major person, to go up to Hayes and try to get him to, as it were, actively oppose what the investigation was engaged in. And Hayes very kindly then would listen to this visit from major person. Then he would call me and say, Norm, come up to my office. I have a good deal to tell you. I would go up. He'd tell me, I've just had a visit from major person, and he wants me to break up this investigation. So I then say, well, Wayne, what did you do? What did you say to him? He said, I just told him to get the hell out. And he did that 3 times, and I got pretty proud of him in the sense that he was, as it were, backing me up. And we finally embarked upon hearings at Hayes' request because he wanted to get them out of the way before he went abroad in the summer. And
why were the hearings finally terminated? What happened to the committee?
What happened to the committee or the hearing?
The hearings. The hearings.
Oh, the hearings were terminated. Carol Reece was up against such a furor as Hayes through the activity of our own counsel. Hayes became convinced that he was being double-crossed, and he put on a show in a public hearing room, Mr. Griffin, that was an absolute disgrace. And he called Carol Reece publicly every name in the book. And Mr. Reece took this as proof that he couldn't continue the hearings. He actually invited me to accompany him when he went down to Hayes' office, and in my presence, with the tears rolling down his face, Hayes apologized to Carol Reece for what he'd done and his conduct, and apologized to me. And I thought that would be enough and Carol would resume. But he never did.
The charge of anti-Semitism is kind of intriguing to me. What was the basis of that charge? Was there any basis for it at all?
No, the basis that the Republican National Committee used was that the intelligence officer I'd taken on my staff, when I oriented this investigation to the exposure of and proof of a conspiracy, was known to have a book, and the book was deemed to be anti-Semitic. This was childish, but this was the second in command of the Republican National Committee, and he told me I would have to dismiss this person from my staff.
Who was that person, sir? Who was that person?
The person?
Yes.
A Colonel Lee Lorraine.
Lee Lorraine.
Yeah.
And what was his book, do you recall? The title of his book?
The book they referred to was called Waters Flowing Eastward, which was a very castigation of the Jewish influence in the world.
What were some of the other charges made by Mr. Hayes against Mr. Reece?
Oh, just that Mr. Reece was utilizing this investigation for his own prominence inside the House of Representatives. That was the only charge Hayes could think of.
How would you describe the motivation of the people who created the foundations, the big foundations in the very beginning? What was their motivation?
Their motivation, well, let's take Mr. Carnegie as an example. His publicly declared and steadfast interest was to counteract the departure of the colonies from Great Britain. He was devoted to just putting the pieces back together again.
Would that have required the collectivism that they were dedicated to?
No. These policies or the foundation's allegiance to these un-American concepts are all traceable to the transfer of the funds over into the hands of trustees, Mr. Griffin. Not the men who had a hand in the creation of the wealth that led to the endowment or as a use of that wealth for what we would call public purposes.
It was a subversion of the original intent then.
Oh, yeah, completely so. And that we got into the world traditionally of bankers and lawyers.
How do you see that the purpose and direction of the major foundations has changed over the years to the present? What is it today?
Whole 100% behind meeting the cost of education, such as it is presented through the schools and colleges of the United States, on the subject of our history has proven our original ideas to be no longer practical. The future belongs to a collectivistic concept, and there's just no disagreement on this.
Why do the foundations generously support communist causes in the United States?
Well, because to them, what communism represents a means of developing what we call a monopoly. That is, the organization, we'll say, of large-scale industry into an administrable unit.
Do they think that they will be one of the administrators?
They will be the beneficiaries of it, yes.
Do you see how deep this rabbit hole goes? Do you see again the corruption, the threat to murder, the threat to slander, the threat to destroy individuals when they call out communism? And we, of course, even see it today. And yet at the exact same time, all of the quote-unquote useful idiots in the business of education have no idea that by holding the position themselves, literally, they are being manipulated. that it's a manipulated position, it's a manipulated profession, and it's all being designed to use them, Americans, to subvert their own country and brainwash their own citizens into believing that certain things are important, other things are not, and that learning the truth is subjective, and that that's not important. And if you even bring up something that counters the mainstream narrative and the narrative that gets brought up in a brick and mortar school, then there's something wrong with you. And you're even penalized for it. It's absolute enslavement. I cannot put it in any other way. You hear, again, I've brought up endless examples on the show here over the last 4+ years. You're well aware of the endless examples. I brought it up very recently within the last few episodes, the parents that keep showing up to these school board meetings and yelling about perverse books. And yet they never think a dimension below it or beyond it and think to themselves, wait a minute, how is it that those books made their way into this library? Is there a history that is already in place that has basically shown this to already happen before? Has that had happened in our country before? Are there other countries where this has taken place? Is this a repetitive behavior by a certain group of people that's allowing all of this to happen? And the answer to all of that, of course, is yes. But they're not thinking about that. They're just saying, well, I don't want my kid around those perverse books. Well, then why do you keep sending your children? They can't possibly grasp the depth of communism, let alone the entire communistic outlook being the foundation of the very education, quote unquote, finger quotes, huge system that exists in our country and has existed since long before 1900. They can't possibly grasp it. I'm going to link Norman Dowd's entire interview from Rumble in the description below this episode if you want to, again, watch the entire thing. It's about an hour long, but again, that was the last 10 minutes of it, approximately. No wonder it's not taught in American education, and specifically, again, in teacher education programs. No wonder. They're quite literally working for and working within and being trained by a communistic system that is communistic. That's why everybody's using the same technology tools without question. That's why you're told if you don't learn how to use these technology tools, there's something wrong with you, or you're not going to get hired. You have to pad your resume with all of this, again, corporate jargon and all of these particular technology tools, and this will somehow increase the likelihood of you getting hired someplace, when in fact it doesn't really matter, because regardless of where you end up getting hired, you just have to learn to use the tools that they use, whether you've ever used them or not, because they have the professional development already in place for you to use them, so you immediately become a part of their communistic system, whether you're familiar with, again, their communistic approach or you aren't. And then, of course, this big picture, good luck getting anybody to explain this. The business of the simple fact that every single history teacher has been manipulated their entire lives. From watching the History Channel on television when they were children, even if, again, they're whatever, young enough to remember any of that, or they were too old to even experience any of that, right down to the fact that they ultimately became K-12 history teachers and then potentially history professors. And their entire profession and the entire time that they've been employed in the business, all they've been doing is misleading people. They either know that they're lying to their own students, or they have no idea that they're lying to them and misleading them because they believe falsehoods. Which, of course, means the people downhill from all of that, i.e. the students and their parents, they won't be the wiser. They won't question anything. They will just say, well, they're your history teachers, so they're going to run you through the same stuff that we had when we were kids, and that'll be that. If it gets a little perverse, then we'll have a problem with that, and we'll raise a fuss from time to time. And if a perverse book comes out, we'll even raise a fuss about that too. But beyond that, it'll basically be the same thing that we got, son or daughter, so you don't have to worry about it, and we'll help you along if we can. It's the blind leading the blind. There's no reforming this system. You cannot do it. It's communistic and manipulative from its foundation because it was designed to be that way. Again, you talk about the Matrix. Holy hell. And I'll tell you this too, it's remarkably overwhelming for me. It's overwhelming having been in the business for 9 years and grown up around the business to, of course, come to the realization that all of it was a lie. And that all of it was purposeful manipulation to ultimately shorten one's lifespan. Again, if I sit down and I think of all of the things that I taught that turned out to not be true, I mean, it can be very depressing. And it's a very difficult thing. But at the exact same time, I have to focus on the fact that there were times and endless times when I did teach the truth because I knew exactly what the truth was. I researched it and then brought it to the students that I had at the time. But even so, I look back and I think what a blessing it is to not be in the business. It's an absolute gift from God. There is no way around it. Because I look at the people that are in the business who are not awake. And I'm specifying that because there are still people who are in the business who are awake. But there are people who are in the business who are not. And that is the vast majority of them. And that's putting it mildly. Those people are flat out enslaved. There's no way around it. And they will probably never wake up. Not ever. Now here, of course, is exactly where all of this and what's going on currently ties right back into that Reece Committee. And all of the money mismanagement and the 3-letter agency and the tax-exempt organizations, so to speak, that exist within the field of education. This was from twitchy.com. It was titled, Department of Education Cancels $600 million in woke teacher training grants. This was from February 17th. The article went on here and it says, it looks like all of the nonprofit contractors who gave presentations on the works of Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo will have to find another grift. The spigot has been cut off. Examples from the grant applications included, quote, building historical and socio-political understandings of race and racism to interpret racial marginalization and oppression of students in planning and instruction relationship building, discipline and assessment, unquote. If teachers want to, quote, interrupt racial marginalization, they could start by teaching their students how to read and do math proficiently, unquote. Yeah. And then they have a bunch of X posts from endless individuals saying, I voted for this, get rid of it all, this is exactly what we wanted to see. Get rid of all these programs, so on and so on. This, of course, is where it gets complicated. Because you can't get rid of communism per se, unless, of course, you get rid of the perpetuators of communism. Again, the very same people and groups of people using the term anti-Semitism and using the term communism and using those two against individuals are the same people who created both of those terms. The people saying you can't look into communism because if you do, you're anti-Semitic. That's a direct admission that Jews created communism. That's all that means. And it's amazing that people can't even make that connection. There was this also, and again, this continues to prove the direction that this business is going. And you have to keep in mind that even though it's getting rid of some of these communistic, whatever you want to call it, parameters, so to speak, or characteristics to some extent, the thing to look out for in the future is whether or not the false curriculum continues to exist, because that's really the bedrock of communism. That's the bedrock of their deception. The Jewish lobby has complete control over that. As long as that text and all of that false history continues to exist in schools, you're not really getting rid of the problem, which is exactly as I've said before, and will continue to beat this drum, that home learning and self-investigation and free will and self-inquiry regarding endless subjects is the only way that a human being is going to arrive at anything that's even close to the truth. You can leave public schools all you want, and I highly recommend it. But if you go into a private or a charter school environment, and you're not shown anything different, and you're not given different perspectives or even a altered perspective, so to speak, on major historic events, then any inquiry really isn't going to be happening. Certainly not within the individual mind, let alone the institution that individual mind is now a part of. But this comes from Breitbart, and it was titled, Tennessee Approves School Voucher Laws Excluding Children of Illegal Aliens. Okay, great. That's good. It says the $447 million program is being termed as universal for parents in the state. However, Republican legislators made sure that one sector will not be able to take advantage of the program, the Associated Press reported, which of course is children of illegals. It says the law orders the State Department of Education to deny any application where a family cannot, quote, establish the eligible student's lawful presence in the United States. However, the bill also seems to lack any process for the DOE or schools to determine a family's immigration status. So, it isn't exactly clear how the status would be checked, which means people will slip through the cracks. It says when he signed the bill, Tennessee's Republican Governor Bill Lee noted the new law would not, quote, change anything about the state's obligation as it currently stands to educate children. But he also insisted that, quote, for this scholarship, it's only available to Tennessee citizens. Again, I like this, not just very selfishly because it proves a point I made many years ago here on the show, which is that public schools would be left for illegal aliens, the physically handicapped, and the mentally disabled, which you've heard me say endless times before, even wrote a Substack about it years ago. But it should show people, again, that the state of Tennessee is moving in that direction because they're trying to siphon money away, of course, from public schools into the private sector and the charter school sector. And I certainly would hope the homeschooling and home learning sector as well. This article goes on here. It says the bill provides for 20,000 vouchers worth around $7,000 each and sets $10,000 aside for lower income and disabled students, while the other half is open to any citizen. The vouchers would be available for the coming school year. It says the bill comes as several states have begun to look for ways to curtail the negative impact that the presence of children of illegal aliens has on a state's education system. Again, who was allowing that? Who was allowing illegal aliens to go to school in American schools? I understand that it's Supreme Court precedent, rather. I mean, I fully get it, but who even allowed for that? It's communists. And who created communism? It says in Oklahoma, for instance, state school superintendent Ryan Walters is clashing with a moderate Republican governor Kevin Stitt due to a proposal approved by the State Board of Education in January to have schools determine the immigration status of children as they register for school. The governor is opposed to the plan and has said he will try to block it from being implemented, the AP reported. Lawmakers in Texas and Indiana are also looking for ways to link immigration to schooling. Like Oklahoma's move to track students' immigration status, lawmakers in Texas have introduced House Bill 1512, which would collect data on the immigration status of children registering for school. Meanwhile, in Indiana, House Bill 1394 has been introduced, which would actually block children of illegal migrants from enrolling in schools. Good. I'm going to make a prediction. I wouldn't be surprised if Oklahoma school superintendent Ryan Walters ends up becoming Oklahoma's governor at some point. He's certainly taken hard stances against the whole communist agenda, bringing Bibles back into classrooms and a number of other positive moves, but time will tell on all of that. If he doesn't get killed beforehand, of course, because he's going right up against communism. And he's going right up against individuals who were blackmailed by communists, which is the Jewish lobby. They're the same thing. But don't worry, I'll get called an anti-Semite because, I call out the people who created communism. It's amazing. It's just it's a giant screwed up cycle of abuse that people just keep falling for. And of course, speaking of that cycle of abuse, let me now bring up Ohio, where I live. The good old Buckeye State, ah yes. Okay, this is also a local issue as well, again having to do with the funding of education. Now, I've mentioned this nitwit's name before. His name is Sean Scott. He puts together what is called the Oxford Free Press in the town where I live here. It's an abomination of a publication because it's very one-sided, as one might expect, unless, of course, he's taking basically a particular angle where you have no choice but to just report on what's actually already transpired. He, of course, is a public school advocate, and the nitwits that he tends to interview, of course, are also public school advocates. In fact, in a recent, city council meeting, one of the female city council members, a Chantel Ragu, she openly stated that she's so happy that the Oxford Free Press exists as a newspaper that it allows her to sleep easy at night because it's, quote, a bedrock of our democracy. Well, joke's on her. We don't live in a democracy. We live in a constitutional republic. Either way, she's a product of some education system somewhere, which was lying to her also. Brought to you by communism. Anywho, with all of that digression aside, here was the title of this particular article, and I want to read it in its entirety because this will tell you how bad things are in Ohio when it comes to public education, and how Republicans in Ohio know that public education is failing. It's a bad business model, which means if you're an investor in business, are you going to keep funding a bad business model that's wasting money, or are you going to look for different businesses that are operating more like a well-oiled machine? Joke's on everybody, it's all communism unless you're funding home learning and homeschooling, and people actually investigating things on their own. See, that's what government doesn't really want. Just again, as a quick little side note before I read through this article, they don't want American families getting together and learning different things to only come back together and teach one another about what they've learned that's so different. One family over here is learning about Jewish communism. The other family over here is learning how Adolf Hitler was bad and the Allies won World War II. You can't do both, which means someone's wrong. See what I mean? They don't want those families learning that on their own, to then again have Becky and Sally get together on a local playground someplace and have a conversation about their differing education and what they're learning. And Becky says, well, no, communism's evil. And then Sally says, no, that's not true. Communism can be a good thing. Think of that level of conflict. Okay, here's the article. It says, funding education. Talawanda funding could be at risk in next state budget. Talawanda, of course, being the local watering hole and well of brainwashing that exists in the town where I live. The subtitle of this was, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine's budget proposal did not include drastic cuts to public education funding, but other lawmakers have signaled a move in that direction this budget cycle. It says the following here. Quote, as he presented his executive budget proposal February 3rd, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine put a heavy focus on children and education. DeWine indicated that he would try to preserve a public education funding plan passed 4 years ago to fix the previous state funding, which had been deemed unconstitutional but that's easier said than done. As the governor sets up for a potential showdown with other legislators during the budget process, schools like the Talawanda School District may get caught in the middle. At stake, millions of dollars in state funding each year, which could have a significant impact on Talawanda if the funding doesn't continue. This story is the third in a series on school finances and the Talawanda School District. It says, what's the current status of state education funding? To understand Ohio's current school funding model, you have to go back to 1997. That year, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that state's public education funding model was unconstitutional. The state constitution requires that the legislature will secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools throughout the state, unquote, a requirement that was not being met because school districts were too reliant on property taxes, resulting in inequitable outcomes based on district wealth. Joke's on everybody. Again, side note, everybody's being lied to. Doesn't matter if you're in some rich suburb where you have a brand new school and all this money and all this technology, or you're dirt poor in a black urban institution and you don't have two sticks to rub together. It doesn't matter. Everybody's being lied to. Money's got nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing. It says, for decades, lawmakers tweaked state funding and proposed solutions to improve state funding. The bipartisan Cupp-Patterson plan, introduced in 2017, was drafted by then-Representative Bob Cupp, a Republican, allegedly, and John Patterson, a Democrat. Well, if it's bipartisan, then they're both lying. It says, however, it took numerous revisions and 4 years for the bill to finally pass as the Fair School Funding Plan in the state's 2021 budget. Republican Sarah Crothers, who used to be our old representative, who was an abomination, who represented Oxford and Hamilton in the State House at the time, co-sponsored the bill, which had passed in the House and made it to a Senate committee during a previous legislative session. Under the Cupp-Patterson plan, every district receives a base cost funding. The state calculates a base cost per pupil for each school district and subtracts the local contribution per pupil from that measure, leaving the base cost per pupil paid by Ohio. Districts may also receive what's known as the guarantee. This is where basically they end up losing money, which is a good thing. It says if the calculations used to determine state funding would result in a sudden drop in support year to year, or a district's enrollment decreases, it may receive guaranteed funding they probably meant, to make up the difference. Talawanda Treasurer Shauna Tefelsky explained that the mechanism prevents districts from receiving less state funding than either the previous year or the previous 3-year average, whichever value is higher. This year, Talawanda is set to receive nearly $8.8 million in state funding, $2.2 million of which comes from the guarantee. It says the Cupp-Patterson plan had a 6-year implementation period. The first 2 years were partially funded, and the next 2 years were fully funded. Years 5 and 6 were being decided in the current budget cycle, and the plan's overall implementation would cost a total of $2 billion if followed through, according to reporting by the State House News Bureau. It says, while introducing this executive budget proposal February 3rd, DeWine said that the biennial budget would include a phase-in of the final 2 years of the Fair School Funding Plan. He added, however, that his plan, allows us to phase out the funding of empty desks in schools by reducing funding guarantees. I'll tell you what, given the length of the article here, I'm just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to summarize this with just a couple more paragraphs. Because again, this right here is what local school officials and school board members who continue to advocate for public education cannot fathom. They cannot understand that there is a long-term plan here to destroy public education on purpose for all of the right reasons. They're stuck in the old way of thinking that we can't possibly not have public education because if we don't have it, what will we do as a nation? You have to be kidding me. It goes on here and it says, quote, Huffman has called the Cupp-Patterson funding model unsustainable, and one Republican member of the House Finance Committee criticized the funding formula for not awarding the merit of outcomes, quote unquote, according to reporting. DeWine's budget would allocate a total of $12.4 billion to state schools in fiscal year 26 and $12.6 billion in 27. It goes on, it says DeWine's budget, however, did not include reductions in the state's private school scholarship program, which cost nearly $1 billion in fiscal year 24. That included more than $400 million in EdChoice expansions, providing vouchers for parents to send children to private schools. Reporting by the Ohio Capital Journal found that while private school voucher spending increased significantly, it only increased by 2%. I bet it increases by more than that. Again, the treasurer was interviewed in this article basically saying we have to be cautious about what proposal is going to be put forth by the state because basically public schools don't know if they're going to get that guarantee or not. They don't know if they're going to end up with a few extra million or they're going to lose more than that. Again, they spend like drunken sailors all the time. When they find money, they instantly spend it and then put back in all the bullshit programs that they had in the first place, which they didn't need to begin with. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. You would think that they would learn, and that if you're so dependent on government will always pull the rug out from underneath you, whether they're communistic or they're not. They're either moving in a less communistic direction or they're doubling down. Either way, it's going to cost public schools money because public schools are the victim of communism and they don't even know it. They are communistic by design. On top of that, another, again, the latest and newest board member on the school board decided to comment on this particular article, basically saying that if you're not funding public school, then you're stabbing everybody in the back. Give me a break. Give me a break. Again, these communists just show their hand any time that money and school are the hot burning topics. They immediately again advocate for both, not knowing that the two of them, both separately and together, are not going to solve the real problem. More schooling by government doesn't solve the underlying problems, and more money doesn't solve it either. But they continue to advocate for both because they're stupid. I mean, it's that simple. I'll wrap it up here, and it says Republican State Senator George Lang, who I voted for, said it's premature for him to comment on specific budget items because of the potential for significant changes before it comes in front of the state Senate. He expects to see a House draft in the next 6 to 8 weeks. He apparently told Sean Scott here, quote, "Once it comes out of the House over here, then we'll take a deep dive and see if the House makes any changes," Lang said. In general, though, I'd like to keep funding for public schools and all schools at some healthy levels. My goal is to increase school choice so that parents can choose whether they want to use public dollars to send their kids to a private educational institution or a public school, unquote. So there you have it. George Lang, apparently a school choice advocate. Just expand that, if it hasn't already been, to home learning programs. Expand it there. It says Lang said that he had not looked into any comments from Speaker Huffman regarding cuts to the current public school funding plan, and no constituents had reached out to him about education funding in the current budget cycle as of February 12th, he said, though he expects that to pick up once the budget bill makes it to the Senate. It says if the guarantee is stripped away entirely, or if the 5% reduction in 2026 impacts districts unevenly across the state, Talawanda could lose up to $2.2 million in funding per year. Good. It says a representative for Governor DeWine's office did not respond to requests for clarification regarding how the guarantee reductions would be implemented. But don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, local whack jobs who love public education and have been the victims of it, and they don't even know it, are going to continue to advocate for the local school district and public education by calling all of these representatives like George Lang at the state Senate and giving him an earful. Because we need public education because we're slaves and we don't know any better and we've never done anything else with our lives. So please continue to fund our enslavement or else. It's asinine. These people are just completely certifiable. It's amazing. Again, brainwashing here is the problem. It truly is. This is really the largest problem, and it's in every facet of our society. It doesn't matter. You can pick a profession, you can pick an outlet, you can pick a tool. It's all brainwashing, and it's all deliberate. That's the other thing that these people don't understand, how dangerous all of this is, because it's purposefully deliberate. Now I'm going to end with this. This is jab related. This is very recent, hot off the presses, February 10th of this year, 2025. This was a letter to the editor in the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology. The title of this letter, again, which was written by, 5 medical doctors. It was titled, Protracted Psychiatric Complications, including Psychosis in a Middle-Aged Man After COVID-19 Vaccination, a Case Report. Now, here's the case, specifically. You have to keep in mind something. Again, these medical doctors believe that COVID is real, and they believe, again, that the vaccines do help. Joke's on them, COVID's not real, and the vaccines don't help. They only kill. But in this case study, they bring up a guy who took the shots and then had to experience electroshock therapy in order to basically mitigate some of his symptoms and attempt to get back to some normal state. So here's the actual case report of the guy before he took the shots and then what happened to him after he did. He took the Pfizer's, by the way. It says, case report. The patient is a 54-year-old male with no prior psychiatric history, well-functioning, with a stable job as supervisor at a large landscaping company. He was married with children and had an excellent relationship with family. He drank alcohol infrequently and did not use any other substances. He has a family history of depression in both his parents. He began to experience symptoms of intense anxiety and paranoia in 2021, 4 days after receiving his second Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccination. He developed severe insomnia and was fearful that police were pursuing him despite nothing to suggest this was a realistic concern. He did not have COVID-19 when his psychiatric symptoms first started and did not have any medical problems aside from asthma. He was hospitalized 2 weeks after his symptoms began at one of the psychiatric facilities in the area. The documents obtained from that facility indicated his complete blood count, complete metabolic panel, B12, folate, and thyroid stimulating hormone were within normal referencing ranges. And basically the guy was in perfect health. I mean, he was in normal health. Here's where it gets dicey. It says the discharge diagnosis by the facility were major depressive disorder with psychotic features and generalized anxiety disorder. It goes on. It says the discharge medications were risperidone, there we go, 2 milligram nightly, buzzperone, 15 milligrams twice a day, and I think that's lithium, 900 milligrams. It says upon discharge, he was referred to our facility for outpatient follow-up in our partial hospital program. It says in the following 2 years, he experienced fluctuations in the symptoms and did not have a sustained return to his pre-morbid level of functioning. It says while outpatient, he developed kidney stones, so his lithium was switched to carbazepine. No way I'm saying that right. This was also discontinued once he developed a rash. His risperidone was switched to, some other drug due to Parkinsonism side effects. He's basically being drugged to death now. He had multiple antidepressant trials, including fluvoxamine and these 2 other drugs, none of which were helpful. Lorazepam, if I'm saying that right, was added without a significant benefit. Again, drugs aren't working, making things worse. He ended up being psychiatrically hospitalized at our facility 3 additional times. He attempted suicide by overdosing on his medications another time by trying to hang himself. Given his age, atypical presentation, and persistence of symptoms, neurology was involved approximately 7 months after the onset of symptoms. Lumbar puncture was notable for elevated protein, multiple sclerosis profile panel, Alzheimer's panel were normal. It says repeat lumbar puncture 4 months later. He's basically just a pincushion now for the medical industry, and then eventually they shocked his brain. It says the patient's last psychiatric hospitalization at our facility was approximately 22 months after the initial onset of his symptoms of anxiety and paranoia. Symptoms at the time of his hospitalization included severe depressive mood, decreased concentration, psychomotor retardation, and catatonia evidenced by decreased oral intake, marked ambivalence, selective mutism, mannerisms, and negativism. Jesus Christ. I mean, they're torturing this guy. All because he took 2 Pfizer jabs. They continued to give him drugs, which none of them worked. They messed around with his dosages, which made things worse and didn't improve anything. And then it finally says symptoms were refractory to medications. So he was ultimately started on ECT. About a month after the admission, he received 11 bifrontal ECT treatments during his hospital stay. His score on the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating scale improved from 39 out of 60 at pre-ECT to 18 out of 60 after 11 ECT treatments. Jesus. All they had to do was probably give the guy nicotine gum, methylene blue, and chlorine dioxide. Instead, they drugged him into absolute psychosis and then electrocuted him. It says he tolerated the ECT treatments well. Well, of course. he has bacon for brains now. He was discharged from the hospital 2 months after his admission. He received 7 additional bifrontal ECT treatments as an outpatient over the course of 3 months. At the first time of his last session, he scored 10 out of 60 on the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale. As of 10 months later, the last ECT session, he had been tapered off his other drugs and was undergoing a slow taper off of lorazepam. He remained in full remission without any relapse of symptoms and had returned to pre-morbid level of function, unquote. Somehow I doubt that. Again, not a medical doctor, but if you electrocute a brain like that, to where your brain looks like scrambled eggs, you're not going to convince me that you somehow just return back to normal after being weaned off of all of these deadly psychotropic drugs, and then, of course, being electrocuted at the same time. Don't say brainwashing isn't real, ladies and gentlemen. Stories and case studies like that are not being reported in the mainstream media and never have been since the start of the shot rollout. They just haven't. And parents are still giving babies, their brand new babies, RSV shots and other shots, and they're dying just a couple days later, and they can't figure out why. Don't say brainwashing isn't real. It most certainly is, which is partially the subject of the next Substack that I'm putting together, which has to do with the COVID disclosure in news headlines. It's right out in front of everybody's face that COVID isn't real, doesn't exist, and the shots do nothing but harm people. This is in headlines and in presidential orders. You would think that this would panic the vaccinated, so to speak. But they either have a level of cognitive dissonance that is next level, or again, they are actually terrified because of what they're actually seeing and thinking about what they've actually done to themselves. Absolutely incredible. Okay, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening as always. Hopefully I'll have that Substack finished by the end of this week. You can move it around to your brain-dead friends if you have any. It might throw them a little bit. But with that said, I'll catch you on Friday. Peace. Thank you for listening to American Education FM. Make sure and check out AmericanEducationFM.com for more information. Take care and God bless.